So I have a mock cylinder head made out of block of rubber for demonstration purposes. I'm going to try to get through this quickly if I can. So the reason I'm making this video is primarily because of hack mechanics, and YouTube is full of them, and so are the shops and dealerships. More than likely you've had a hack mechanic work on your car and not even realize it. Your trusted mechanic that you've gone to for 9 million years is more than likely a hack mechanic. Hack mechanics lack a fundamental understanding of what they're doing. I have had mechanics put me down because I went to college to learn automotive. Well, the fact is that I already knew how to work on cars prior to going to college. My dad was a mechanic. He had a shop. I grew up in his shop. I was rebuilding carburetors and rebuilding transmissions and rebuilding heads and motors and doing all kinds of repair work long before I ever went to school. When I got out of the Army, I had to decide what I was going to do, and I eventually settled on going through the auto tech program. Prior to making that decision to take the automotive course, I was only going to take, I think, one class on something. I can't remember what it was. And I remember making a comment to the instructor that I already knew how to work on cars and I didn't need the auto tech program and all that. And so he asked me a question and I couldn't answer the question. I had no idea what the answer was. And he looked at me and he said, "You need to be in this program." It was a very humbling moment because I should have known the answer to that, but it was, I can't remember what he asked, but I remember that it was something that you just would not have learned just from working in the shop, learning from another mechanic. And automotive for many years had been like that. You learned by an apprenticeship. You got a job in the shop and you learned from another mechanic. The problem is that, okay, these guys are doing repairs, but they also have a lot of bad habits. They're not really repairing things properly, and they're passing these bad habits on to you. And a lot of these mechanics on YouTube think that these guys are the gold standard of learning automotive, and they're not. I learned in the time that I went through the auto tech program things that I would have never learned just doing an apprenticeship in a dozen different shops. One of the things that I learned is what I'm going to go over with you today on the cylinder head. And I would have never, ever learned this had I not gone to school. Hack mechanics have outright dissed me and attacked me for what I'm about to go over. I have had mechanics, and even on YouTube, state that they have had thousands of vehicles with no problems. You can shave the head that's warped and put it all back together and it'll be great for the life of the vehicle. We're going to go through all that. You have hack mechanics that always have this idea of things are good enough, close enough. They've never seen any problems. They did thousands of them. Everything was fine. These are mindsets that hack mechanics have. So what I'm going to go over is reasons why you do not want to resurface your cylinder head. Now, most mechanics out there have no idea about what I'm about to go over. They will mill a cylinder head and give it back to you or put it back on your car without second thinking what they just did. They will even argue with you that you're wrong, even though they're the ones that are wrong. So we have here our model cylinder head. The main reason a mechanic is going to want to mill the cylinder head is because it's warped. Cylinder heads will warp in one of two ways. They'll either warp this or they'll warp like this. And this is why I made this rubber model, so that I could exaggerate what you're seeing. Now, you're not going to see those warps with your naked eye. You're going to need a straight edge to be able to see that type of warping. And there's a couple ways to do that. Now on overhead cam engines, these main caps or cam caps will come off, and you take the cam off and you've got flat surfaces that you can lay this across and you can detect warping there. But the primary way that they're going to do it is by putting the straight edge across there and sticking a feeler gauge in there to see if it's warped or not. And so there's various different ways of detecting the warp. And then your feeler gauges are going to be certain thicknesses, and you're going to find the thickest gauge that's going to fit in there so that you know how much it's warped. Now let's say you can pick either way. If the cylinder head is warped, and we machine the deck and make it flat again, have we taken the warp out of the cylinder head? Nope, still warped. But these hack mechanics will argue with you that the cylinder head is straight because they machined it. That cylinder head is still warped, and they just machined the deck of it. So this deck is nice and flat. It's no longer warped, according to their eyeballs and measurements, but that head is warped. Now, what are the problems associated with that warping that they just ignored? So take a look at the valve stems. These are your intake, these are your exhaust valves, this is a mock cam. Now, there are different types of heads and different types of arrangements for your valve train. You could have a dual head cam, you could have a single cam, you could have rockers coming off your cam that are going to operate like that, or you could have your valves directly under the lobes and you have little metal discs that push your valve open and close. There's all kinds of different arrangements, but the issues are the same regardless of arrangement. And in some cases, like a dual overhead cam, I mean, you're just talking an added nightmare with a warped cylinder head. So watch what happens to the valves and this line when the cylinder head is warped. See that? So what's the valve stems doing? And it's the same thing if it's warped. It's a little harder to do, but if it's warped the other way. So what's happening is your valve train geometry is going all out of whack. And then your cam and cam journals have stresses placed on them. And what's going to happen is it's going to wear out. It's going to wear prematurely on the cam journals and on the cam. It's also going to wear prematurely on these contact surfaces on the valves. Your valve train geometry is all off, and so your rockers, or however the cam is opening and closing the valve, is going to be off. And after you've shaved a warped head, you've got another issue. These two outer combustion chambers are going to be smaller. See, the head's warped. You've just shaved it. You've taken off a whole bunch of material on the end. And it's the same thing if it's here. You've taken off a whole bunch of material on either end here, or whichever way it's warped. And so these have become smaller than these in the middle. What kind of problems is that going to cause? It's going to create an engine imbalance because you've now got higher compression ratios on the outer cylinders than you do on the inner cylinders. An increased compression ratio puts added stresses on rod and main bearings. Now, it may be a slight amount, it could be more, it could be not so bad, it's just kind of hard to say. You're going to get an additional problem of crankshaft twisting. So your crankshaft inside of your car, as your pistons are firing, your crank will actually twist. It will actually be doing this number. Cranks twist. Automotive manufacturers will tend to put distributors in the front of the vehicle and time the vehicle based off of that because they're timing off of the first top dead cylinder. Whereas if you have one in the distributor in the back and you're timing off the top dead center number one cylinder, the engineers account a little bit for crank twist. Now, again, you can't see crank twist, but it's there. Inline sixes will tend to have a lot of crank twist. V6s and four cylinders will have a lot less crank twist. You've got an imbalanced engine, you've got smaller combustion chambers. You also will increase your NOx emissions, which could possibly cause your vehicle to fail emissions if it's a California vehicle, depending on the vehicle. In Japan, doing this, their emission requirements are so strict, it'll fail it right off the bat. In fact, in Japan, their emissions are so strict, after so many miles, their engine won't pass emissions no matter what they do to it. And so they have to put a whole new engine in it. The engine that comes out of it is still a very good engine. And those engines get sent here to the States and get sold as used engines, which you can buy for $600, $700, $800. You can, a lot of times if you have a blown engine, it's just cheaper to swap it out for a used engine if your vehicle's Japanese. So you've got that issue. The other issue you have is once you've taken a chunk of material off to straighten the deck out, you have water jackets in here. Now, if the head's warped and you've just taken a chunk of material off of here and you've got a water jacket in here, how thick is that area of the water jacket now? Well, it's a lot thinner. So now you've got a thinner water jacket here and a heavier water jacket there. You've got a heavier water jacket here and a thinner water jacket there. Or if it's like this, well, then you've got a thinner water jacket here and a thicker one in the middle. What's going to happen with that? You're going to get overheating. These are going to get hotter, and you're more likely to blow a head gasket, burn your valves, rewarp the head. The overall engine's going to end up running hotter, which is not good. Heat is the enemy of engines. You don't want your motor to run hotter. Now, overall, machining a warped head is going to reduce the overall life of your entire engine. Not just this. When you increase the compression ratio, you're putting added stress on the camshaft, on the rod bearings and the main bearings, so they're going to wear out quicker. You're going to get added crank twist. It's not a good idea. So what is the proper fix here? Rather than milling the warped head, you've got one of two options. Either heat straightening the head or buying another head. That's your only two options. Now what heat straightening does is they will mount the head on a big metal plate. They will figure out the warp, and let's say it's warped like this. So what they'll do is they'll shim up two opposite corners like so and make it rewarp in an opposite direction, and they'll torque the head down. And then they basically bake the engine for about 5 hours, and then they come back and check it. In order to have a straight head, you've got to make sure that there's no warp across cam journals so that you don't get any stresses on the cam journals. And then they're going to check the deck there for warpage. And once they have that warp out, then you're good to go. Heat straightening is expensive. You're going to be lucky to find a shop that does it, because most mechanics have never heard of this. The things that I just showed you in regards to this head, most mechanics have no clue about, and they will just pass it off. No, it'll be fine. No, I've never seen a problem with any of them. I've decked thousands of heads, never had a problem. You'll be fine. That's what I mean when I'm talking about a hack mechanic. They have never heard about any of these problems. The hack mechanics that I've had arguments with, where I've brought all this up, they resort to personal attacks to defend their position because they have no defense for their position. Or they'll say that, well, you're just a number chaser, or you're just obsessive compulsive with precision, that kind of nonsense. There's a proper way and an improper way to repair something. I just showed you the proper way to repair it. One thing I'm not saying is you can't ever resurface your head. What I'm saying is surfacing a warped head doesn't take the warp out. It's still warped. Once your head is straight, everything is lined up, all the lights are green, we need to look at the surface of the head. Now, a lot of times the surface will be really dirty. In the minds of a lot of people, that plays with them, and so they need to deck the head to make it nice and clean and shiny looking. If there are no surface imperfections, there's no reason to resurface the head. You can put the head back together, provided you're doing that repair right, and that's going to be the subject of another video. But if you have some damage on here, then it might be wise to go ahead and surface it after you've straightened it. That's okay to a point, and the reason it's okay is that now that it's straight, you can take a really, really super light skim pass. Whereas before, you're taking off a chunk of material. Well, now that it's straight, you don't need to take a whole lot of material off. You can take off just a tiny little bit of material just to clean up, because you might have a low spot here, you know, a low spot there, and there's nothing that you're going to do to get that to come out. And if it's over a water jacket, then you're going to want to do a light skim pass just to make sure you've got that covered, so that when you do bolt this back together, your water jackets aren't going to leak, your combustion chambers aren't going to leak into the head gasket or between there. There are times when resurfacing the head is just fine. You are going to increase the compression ratio. But if you do that super light skim pass and do the bare minimum to get by, and you're not taking the huge chunks out that you are with the warped head, you should be fine. Is it going to place added stresses on your crankshaft and your rod and main bearings? Yeah, it will. How much? Probably not much. Not nearly as much as if you're building a hot rod and you know, you shave your head a lot to get a really high compression ratio. Then you're placing a lot of stress on your rod and main bearings. So you can get away with this. Are your NOx emissions going to increase? Yes, they will. Will it pass emissions after that? I don't know. It may not. If it's a federal car, you'll probably be fine. If it's a California car, depending on the make and model, you may not pass emissions after you do that. So you have to question whether surfacing the head is really necessary, or buying another cylinder head and starting from scratch. Here's another problem. If you have just a 4-cylinder or inline 6, you've got one cylinder head, and on one side you have your intake, on the other side you have your exhaust. Hypothetically, sometimes you have your intake and exhaust on the same side, but for this, let's just say it's this and that side. You have no problems. You can bolt everything back together, you're good to go. But if this is a V6, you've got another problem after you've surfaced your head. If the head is straight and you've done a super light skim pass, probably not going to be as much of a problem, but it does need to be checked. Okay, so let's pretend my hands are the intake side of the cylinder head. So you're going to have an intake manifold that's going to sit on top of the intake ports there. Right in the V of my hands, that manifold is going to sit down. What's going to happen is, because you shaved this, all these ports are now that much lower. So if you've taken 5 thousandths off of the deck, these ports are going to be 5 thousandths lower. Now that may not sound like much, but what's going to happen is, now that manifold will more than likely still bolt up. But what's going to happen is it's not going to be port matched anymore, because that manifold is going to sit lower. This intake on the head is going to be sitting higher. The runner on the manifold is going to be 5 thousandths lower. So what's that going to cause? You're going to have a lip sticking out. Will your car still run? Yeah, it will. But this is going to impede performance. You're going to get a restriction and turbulence because of that. We ran into this problem when I used to race, and we would always take the heads to have them shave as much off as possible to increase the compression ratio. And of course, the manifolds never fit right afterwards. So we would have to port match, and then we would go ahead and blue it all up, mark everything out, and then we would grind whatever was sticking up, and do that between this and the manifold in order to get all the ports to match up. So that's something that has to be a consideration. If you have a V6 and you shave the heads, the mechanic, the hack mechanic, is going to tell you, oh no, it's fine, no, don't worry about it. You know, done thousands of them, never seen a problem. You know, you'll put the car back together like that, and yeah, you're not going to notice a problem. But does that mean there's not a problem just because you don't notice it? So like I said, chances are it may not be a problem taking that much off, but with the V6, you're going to have to check to make sure your manifold and your heads are aligning properly. So now that we've got the cylinder head repaired and we're ready to put it back together, there's some other things that you want to do to make sure that you're not going to overheat your car and rewarp this head. So you're going to want to check your cooling system. You're going to want to check your radiator to make sure it's clean or dirty. You're going to want to check the fan to make sure it's working properly and working within spec. You have a temperature sensor. You're actually going to have a temp sensor for the fan, and then you're going to have another temp temperature sensor on the engine, which is going to tell the computer when to go into closed loop. So both of those sensors need to be checked because they're both related to your cooling system. You also have to check your thermostat, because if your thermostat is bad, then you're going to overheat your car and you're going to rewarp that head. Now, another consideration with the thermostat, where do you live? Do you live in a predominantly hot climate, or do you live in an area where it's really hot in the summer and really cold in the winter? Where you live is going to determine how often you need to deal with that thermostat, because you may need to change that thermostat a couple times a year. You may need to put a colder thermostat in for summertime and a warmer thermostat in for wintertime. If you're in a predominantly colder environment, you're probably going to need a warmer thermostat all the time, and if you're in a predominantly hotter climate, you're going to need a colder thermostat all the time. The other thing with thermostats is that they have a shelf life. You need to replace them every so often, but that thermostat, if you ignore it, it's going to lead to problems down the road. The preventative maintenance that you want to pay attention to is proper oil level, because oil does remove heat from your motor. If you're low on oil, you're going to have excessive heat buildup, in addition to excessive wear possibly. You want to check your coolant on a regular basis, make sure it's full and where it's at, and that your overfill is at the level it's supposed to be, and that everything is working there properly. Make sure that you don't drive like a maniac. Driving on the road is not a racetrack. You're not Mario Andretti, so you don't want to abuse your vehicle as you're driving. When I started the video and I was talking about hack mechanics, I can promise you that you'll be lucky to find a single mechanic anywhere in your town that knows what I just told you. And if they do know, you'll be even luckier if they agree with what I just told you. There's only one way to repair your vehicle, and that's the right way. One guy on YouTube said, "Oh, I've done thousands of cylinder heads that were severely warped, and you know, they're good for the life of the vehicle. You'll never see any issue. They've never ever been a problem." So what I'm curious is, what is the life of the vehicle? What is the determination of what the life of the vehicle is? Because if that head is warped and you've surfaced that head and put a warped head back together, and you've got all these stresses going on, and you've got mixed match combustion chambers and an imbalanced engine, how long do you think that engine's going to last compared to a motor where the head is straight and it's not warped and you don't have any of those issues going on? What motor is going to last longer? And the answer is obvious. So how can this mechanic say what the life of the vehicle is, especially when we have vehicles that are making in excess of 500,000 miles now, and even 1 million miles if you know how to play your cards right? And there's going to be a video on how to do that coming up. Is this mechanic that's saying all this is just fine, is he a statistician? Is he monitoring all these vehicles and keeping statistics on them that he can accurately say it's fine? How does he really know? How many of these vehicles come back to him? Now, I can tell you from experience, 40 years in the shop, it's very rare that one of those vehicles that he worked on is going to come back to him in order for him to definitely say, "Oh, well, I did this repair and it failed because I did it wrong." Can you take the word of this mechanic? If you have a mechanic like that, you need to find another mechanic. Mechanics that are hack mechanics are not honest people, and they don't have very good value. So why do you want to deal with them? You can go up and down YouTube and find quote-unquote mechanics resurfacing cylinder heads. I even found a guy showing how you can surface a cylinder head the cheap way if you can't afford it, and he's laying sandpaper down. This is a precision flat surface, okay? This mechanic didn't even have a precision flat surface, and he's gluing sandpaper down and then running the cylinder head over it. This guy's a supposed mechanic. Machine shops, automotive machine shops that are doing videos of them surfacing heads all the time. And they've been in business 40, 50 years, if not longer. And a ton of mechanics that will argue about everything I just told you. That's pretty much it. There'll be some other videos coming on what is a proper head gasket repair. Another video on how you can make your vehicle get 1 million miles before you have to rebuild that engine.